Let's go back to the year 185 AD. For a man like Marcus Aurelius Severus, life is exactly what it was supposed to be. You are Marcus. You're 52 years old, a retired centurion of the 14th Legion. You spent 25 years on the damp, foggy edges of Britannia, bleeding for the eagle just so you could, one day, return to these sun-drenched hills of central Italy. You did everything right. You followed the rules. You took your retirement a respectable bonus of roughly 12,000 silver denarii, and you put it into a modest farm just outside Capua. From your porch, the Roman Empire looks eternal. The roads are paved, the aqueducts are full, and your life savings are tucked away in a heavy ceramic jar beneath the floorboards. You are the backbone of the state, one of the mediocres, the middle ones. You aren't a senator with 1,000 slaves, but you aren't a beggar in the city streets either. You are safe. At first, the shift is so subtle you almost miss it. You're at the local market, holding a handful of denarii to pay for a new iron plowshare, but you notice the coins feel different. They lack that sharp, bright ring against the stone counter. They look duller, greyer. When you try to pay the blacksmith, he lingers on them a second too long. He isn't looking at you, he's looking at the metal. He asks for 2 more coins than he did last season. The iron is more expensive, he says, though he won't look you in the eye. You don't know it yet, but the silver content in those coins, the very foundation of your life savings, has been quietly reduced by the emperor's mint. The state is broke. It's fighting wars it can't afford, and it has decided to pay its debts by stealing the value of your labor, 1 gram of silver at a time. You go home and look at your farm at the rows of olive trees you planted for your sons. For the first time, the ground beneath your feet feels less like solid earth and more like shifting sand. The system still looks stable from the outside. The legionaries still march. The temples still stand. But as you hold that dull grey coin in your hand, you realize the betrayal has already begun. The story of Marcus isn't just a lesson in ancient history. It's a study of how wealth is quietly harvested from the people who trust the system most. While the tools of the modern age have changed, the mechanics of economic gravity have stayed exactly the same. This is an exploration of a collapse that was never officially announced. It was simply felt, 1 coin at a time. If you open a history textbook, the fall of Rome is usually shown with fire. You see Goths swarming over the walls, temples in flames, and the dramatic blood-soaked end of a civilization. It's a convenient narrative. It's loud, it's visual, and it puts the blame on an external other. But for the people living through the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, the tragedy wasn't a single explosion. It was a slow, agonizing leak. The official story, the one broadcast from the marble halls of the Palatine Hill, was that Rome was as powerful as ever. The Emperor Commodus, and later the Severan dynasty, still held lavish games. They still built massive public baths and celebrated triumphs. To anyone passing through in the year 190 AD, the Roman machinery looked invincible. But if you looked closer at the ledgers, you'd see the rot. Rome had a math problem that no amount of military might could solve. The empire had reached its geographic limits. The era of easy wealth, where they could simply conquer a new kingdom and bring home literal tons of gold and silver, was over. But the costs of maintaining the state were only going up. The army, once a lean fighting force, had become a massive, hungry bureaucracy. To keep the soldiers from revolting, the state had to keep raising their pay. In 180 AD, a legionary earned about 1,200 sesteti. By the time of Caracalla, that had nearly doubled. Since Rome didn't have a central bank or a way to issue bonds, they couldn't just borrow money to cover the gap. They had to find it. And this is where the official story of Roman glory diverged from the reality of Marcus's life. The state began a process we now call currency debasement. In the days of Augustus, the silver denarius was nearly pure, about 95% silver. By the time Marcus was trying to buy that plowshare, it had dropped to about 75%. Soon, it would be 50%, then 5%. Eventually, it was nothing more than a copper coin with a thin, deceptive wash of silver on the outside. The government told the public these coins were still worth the same. They used the law to demand that Marcus and his neighbors accept these grey, base metal slugs as if they were the high-purity silver of their grandfathers. It was a legal fiction. The state was essentially lying to its own citizens to fund a military it could no longer afford. While the elite in Rome was still drinking from silver cups, The middle class, the veterans, the shopkeepers, the small landowners were being liquidated. They were the ones holding the currency as it melted in their hands. The empire wasn't being conquered yet. It was being hollowed out from the inside, funded by the quiet confiscation of the people's savings. To understand how Marcus lost everything, we have to look at the evidence left behind in the dirt. When archaeologists dig up Roman coin hoards today, they see a timeline of theft. They see a currency that essentially committed suicide. The breakdown of the Roman middle class followed a predictable sequence of institutional failure. The Great Dilution. In the year 215 AD, the Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus. On the surface, it looked like a triumph. It was larger and was officially decreed to be worth 2 denarii. But there was a catch one that the middle class was the last to understand. The new double coin only contained about 1/5 times the silver of a single denarius. By decreeing a value that didn't exist in the metal, the state had effectively institutionalized a 25% tax on every transaction in the empire. It was an invisible levy. If you held 10 of these coins, you were told you were wealthy. In reality, the state had already pocketed the difference to pay for border walls and the ever-growing salaries of the Praetorian Guard. The death of price discovery. The market, however, isn't easily fooled by government decrees. As the silver disappeared, shopkeepers and merchants began to raise their prices. They weren't being greedy. They were trying to survive. If a loaf of bread cost 1 denarius when the coin was 90% silver, it logically had to cost 2 coins when the silver dropped to 45%. This was the birth of the inflationary spiral. For Marcus, this was catastrophic. His pension, that 12,000 denarii buried in the jar, was a fixed amount. As prices doubled, then tripled, then increased tenfold, his life's work began to evaporate without him spending a single cent. He was doing everything right, yet he was becoming poor by simply standing still. The tax extraction trap. As the currency became worthless, the Roman state faced a paradox. It had created the junk money, but it didn't want to take it back. The government began to demand that taxes be paid in gold or kind, meaning actual gold coins or a percentage of Marcus's grain and olive oil. However, when the state paid Marcus for supplies for the army, they paid him in the very copper-washed coins they refused to accept as taxes. This was the ultimate betrayal. The state was forcing the middle class to subsidize the empire's survival with real assets, land and labor, while giving them monetary theater in return. This created a massive liquidity crunch. Marcus couldn't sell his olives for enough good money to pay the taxes on his land. The flight to the latifundia. The final break happened when the middle class realized the protection of the state was now more expensive than the threats it was supposed to guard against. To escape the tax collectors and the useless currency, the Roman middle class began to disappear. They didn't die out, they vanished into a new, more primitive system. Marcus, unable to pay his debts, eventually gave up his independence. He sold his small farm to a nearby patens, a wealthy, politically connected senator who owned a massive estate called a latifundium. Because these elites were part of the government, they had the loopholes to avoid the taxes Marcus couldn't. Marcus stayed on the land, but he was no longer a landowner. He was now a colonus, a tenant farmer. He had traded his freedom for the safety of a powerful man's protection. The middle class was being replaced by a two-tiered society, the ultra-wealthy who owned the world and the working poor who served them. The roads were still there. The map still said Rome, but the social contract that made Marcus a citizen was dead. He was now just a gear in a machine that no longer recognized his value. We like to think we would see it coming, that if the money in our pockets started to lose its weight, we would stand up and speak out. But history shows that the most dangerous shifts are the ones that happen while we're busy just trying to make ends meet. Marcus didn't notice the collapse because there were no alarms. There was only a slow, quiet erosion of his dignity. The people who survived this period weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones who recognized the pattern before it became the law. Understanding these cycles is the only way to see through the official stability of any era. And as we look at who actually thrived while Marcus fell, the distinction between a victim and a survivor becomes uncomfortably clear. When a system begins to hollow out, the exit doors are never the same size for everyone. While Marcus was watching his life's work dissolve into a jar of copper slugs, another class of Romans was not just surviving, They were consolidating more power than the Republic would have ever allowed. To understand this divide, we have to look at the difference between monetary wealth and structural wealth. The losers of the Roman collapse were the savers. People like Marcus believed in the promise of the currency. They held denarii. They lived in the middle, too wealthy to be subsidized by the state, but too small to influence policy. They were exposed. When the currency debased, their wealth had nowhere to hide. Because they relied on the markets to buy food and the state to pay their pensions, they were the first to be ground down. But the winners, the survivors, played a different game entirely. They didn't hold currency. They held control. The power of the hard pivot. The primary survivors were the senatorial elite. These were families who had seen the writing on the wall decades earlier. They understood a fundamental truth that Marcus didn't. When a government is broke, the law is no longer a shield, it is a vacuum. These elites stopped thinking in terms of money and started thinking in terms of self-sufficiency. They used their remaining gold, real high-purity gold ori that never even circulated among the common people, to buy up the failing small farms of the middle class. They turned their estates into what we now call villa economies. While the cities were starving, the senatorial estates were becoming independent kingdoms. They built their own granaries, their own blacksmith shops, and their own private security forces. They stopped caring about the price of bread in the markets because they grew their own grain. They didn't care about the value of the denarius because they moved toward a system of barter and patronage. If you were a senator, you didn't need the state to function. You were the state on your own land. Political proximity as an asset. The second group of survivors were those with political proximity. In a collapsing economy, being close to the source of the new money is the only way to stay ahead of inflation. High-ranking military officers and government contractors received their payments first. They spent the debased coins while they still had some purchasing power, passing the hot potato of the failing currency down to the merchants and soldiers before the prices could adjust. By the time those coins reached a man like Marcus in a rural province, the value had already been stripped away by the people at the top. The survival of the unproductive. There was a third, smaller group that survived, the bureaucracy. As the economy worsened, the Roman state didn't get smaller, it got larger and more desperate. It hired more tax collectors, more secret police, and more administrators to oversee price controls. These people were protected because they were necessary for the state's extraction. They were paid in actual physical goods, while the rest of the empire was forced to gamble with silver coins that were mostly lead. The collapse created a brutal new hierarchy. On one side, you had the liquidated, the independent, law-abiding middle class who followed the rules and were punished for it. On the other, you had the tethered, the elites who owned the means of production, and the peasants who served them. The winners didn't just keep their money, they changed the nature of wealth itself. They moved away from a complex market economy and back toward a primitive feudal one. They survived by shrinking their world until it was something they could defend with a private wall and a private army. Marcus stayed on his land, but the middle was gone. He was now part of a permanent underclass, working for a man who was once his peer, paying his rent in olives because the money of Rome had become a ghost. History is rarely a straight line. It's more like a rhythm, a series of pulses, where the same pressures produce the same results, regardless of the technology. You look at Marcus and the Grey, leaden coins in his jar, and feel a sense of distant pity. We tell ourselves that we live in a world of sophisticated central banking and transparent markets. We believe we have outgrown the crude thievery of the Roman mint, but the ghost of Marcus is still walking the streets of the modern world. The primary mechanism that destroyed the Roman middle class wasn't the fall of Rome itself. It was the invisible transfer of wealth from the productive many to the protected few. Today, we don't call it debasement. We call it the rising cost of living, or asset price inflation. But for the person trying to build a stable life, the result is identical. In the 3rd century, the emperor didn't walk into Marcus's house and steal his furniture. He simply changed the definition of the money Marcus had earned. Today, we see this in the widening gap between the value of labor and the value of assets. If you work for a salary, you are Marcus holding the denarius. You are trading your finite time for a currency that, by design, loses a percentage of its purchasing power every single year. Since the 1970s, the median house price in the United States has risen significantly faster than the median household income. This isn't because houses are better now, it's because the currency used to measure them has been diluted. Just as the Roman state expanded the money supply to fund its borders and bureaucracy, Modern systems use expansionary policy to manage debt. And just like in 200 AD, there is a survivor divide in how this plays out. The modern latifundia are not sprawling slave-run estates, they are the massive institutional investors and corporations that have the proximity to the source. This is what economists call the Cantillon effect. When new money enters the system, the people who get it first, large banks and ultra-wealthy investors, can spend it before prices have risen. By the time that money filters down to the local supermarket, the prices have already adjusted upward. The middle is always the last to receive the money, but the first to pay the higher prices. We see the return of the colonus in the rentership society. In the late Roman Empire, independent farmers found it impossible to keep up with costs, so they surrendered their land to the elites in exchange for stability. Today, we see a massive trend toward the institutional ownership of homes. The dream of ownership is being replaced by a subscription model. You pay for your housing, your transportation, and your software, but you own none of it. You are allowed to live on the land, but you no longer own the dirt. This is the quiet disappearance of the middle class. It isn't a sudden event, it's a series of small, logical choices made under the pressure of a system that is slowly liquidating the value of work. When the cost of independent survival becomes too high, people naturally gravitate toward the protection of larger institutions. The Roman middle class didn't stop existing because they were lazy. They disappeared because the math of their world no longer worked for the individual. The system still looked stable. The empire still claimed to be in charge. But for the average family, the bridge to the future had been dismantled, 1 silver gram at a time. As we look at our own savings accounts and digital balances, we have to ask the same question Marcus should have asked. Is the system protecting your wealth, or is it using your wealth to protect itself? It is the year 205 AD. Marcus is 72 years old now. He still sits on that same porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, but the view belongs to someone else. The farm he bled for in Britannia is no longer his. He is a colonus, now a tenant on the estate of a man he has never met as senator, who lives in a marble villa and hasn't felt the sting of inflation a single day in his life. Marcus's sons do not go to school. They do not dream of the legion. They dream only of finishing the harvest so they can keep enough grain to survive the winter. Beneath the floorboards, the heavy ceramic jar is still there, but Marcus doesn't check it anymore. The 12,000 silver denarii are still in the jar, but they are dead. They are dull grey pieces of base metal that merchants won't even look at. The math of his life simply ceased to function. He didn't lose his wealth to a barbarian raid. He'd lost it to a system that decided its own survival was more important than the promises it made to its citizens. History remembers the fall of Rome as a thunderclap, a sudden, violent end. But for Marcus, the end didn't come with a bang. It came with the quiet rustle of a tax collector's scroll and the dull thud of a worthless coin. The roads were still paved, the aqueducts still flowed. To the rest of the world, the empire looked eternal. It looked stable, it looked safe, until one day it simply wasn't.